Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Good morning, everybody. We had a couple of technical difficulties this morning. We were planning on all being together and as panelists, and we were not able to do that. So bear with us if there's a couple hiccups here and there, but I think we should be good to go. We are recording this session. It will be available on our YouTube channel sometime in the next few days. And seed companies, we will add them as panelists after everyone has presented, and we will have some Q&A time. And then there are also videos of each of their presentations that will be live on our YouTube channel immediately following the meeting. So I think that's all we have for housekeeping. If you guys have questions, you can enter them in the chat box in the bottom. And we're going to start off with Corey.
Okay, are you ready for me?
I think so.
All right. Well, good morning, everybody. I'm coming at you live from the Research Center here this morning. Excited to have everybody on the Zoom meeting here. I think we got a fun set of information to share with you. A lot of new varieties, a lot of good stuff this year. So lot to learn, lot to look at, and it's going to be a pretty exciting year, in my opinion, when it comes to seed selection. So, we've been talking about Michigan Sugar strategy here for a couple of years. This goal of 9,000 pounds of sugar per acre on average, with and that's a 30 tons per acre and 300 RWST. And as I share some things with you this morning, as you look at some things. I mean, last year, obviously, we had no problem hitting 30 tons. So with a record yield of around 37.5, that's not an issue. But this sugar per ton is really the challenge, really the opportunity. And if we're going to hit that 300 RWST, really going to need to focus on variety selection based on RWST. So there's a big component, a big genetic component to sugar per ton. And so varieties are the place to start there. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how we've been working on improving disease management through variety selection, some opportunities for this higher sugar yield, and then, what we could do to reduce risk. And varieties are a key component for reducing risk in terms of growing the crop, both in disease management as well as for production standpoint. So first, improved disease management. So here we're looking at seed sales over the last few years by leaf spot risk. And so if you look at 2018 versus 2019, we've seen an improvement in terms of reduced disease in sugar beets, or improved disease tolerance. So look at 2018, about 51% of our varieties were considered high risk. In 2019, we reduced that quite a bit. So, and improved the varieties that have higher disease tolerance. If you flip through, oh gosh, yeah, that's going to stay on there. I take it. Let's see. I got to figure out how to clear my highlighters. I thought I was just going to highlight that. That's going to be no fun. Hey, Elizabeth, any help on that one? I could change my arrow options to, let's see. Shoot. Let's see. Can I delete my highlights? Let's see if that'll change here.
I don't know.
Okay, I think I can clear all. There we go. Sorry. Thank you. Clear all drawings. I guess I won't do that anymore. I thought I'd be cute with the Zoom, but it didn't quite work out. So you can see here in 2020, can you guys see my pointer okay as I scroll it across the screen with the
yes.
Okay, so that should look good. So in 2020, we were able to basically reduce our risk quite a bit in terms of leaf spot risk, and we had a higher percentage than ever of improved disease managed varieties. And you flip forward to last year, 2021, we did have a few higher risk varieties. A lot of that comes in nematode, but also we had more tolerance than ever in our varieties at 56% compared to 2020. So that's really encouraging. That's very exciting in terms of leaf spot options. We have more and more options for leaf spot. The challenge again comes in the nematode side of the portfolio. Okay, let's talk a little bit about higher sugar yield. So when you talk about sugar yield, you kind of got to talk about the crop and what happened in weather. So I want to review, I'll take a little time to review this last year and what happened in terms of production, planting, and maybe kind of explains, you know, some of the situation here for this year. So we had a very early planting and another freeze. So we had that last year as well. 25% of our planting was completed by April 4th. So right before Easter. And then 95% of our planting again was done by April 30th. That's the second year in a row. So we're really, that early planting really sets us up for opportunity, which we saw that in the yield this year. We did have quite a bit of replanting. Some of the highest replants we've had as well this last year. And a lot of that was due to the freeze that happened in around the 20s of April. That really damaged the beets that were planted after Easter, after that April 4th timeframe. So we had quite a few beets go in between, say, the 5th and the 10th. And those beets did have the most injury from the frost, although some of them made it. So you see that in some of the data. There's some trials where they made it, and they were very good, the ones that survived that. But we did have that freeze damage. So if you think back, May and June, it was moist and hot. So we did have a bit of rain. It was quite warm, and so the beets, that kind of took off and started going really well. We did have a little bit of higher risk of seedling disease. So we did see a little more fusarium as well, and some of that's in the piles. And we'll talk a little bit about that here in terms of, we're looking for some ways to measure fusarium a little bit better and the impact on the varieties to our crop and how the varieties tolerate that. That is something that we do test for, but it's not here in Michigan. So with the warm, hot May, then basically, mid-June to July, it dried right out to basically drought, right? So we did have, we were in, actually considered a drought area, severe drought area for a long time. And then September and October happened. And so you see that big shift in the weather and how that impacted the crop. We had quite variable weather throughout the growing season. So the West was extremely wet late. Everybody was wet, but the West was extremely wet late. We had areas that received 11 inches of rain per day in one day. And even that wasn't so bad in itself. It was just the 2 inches that kept happening about every other day after that was really the problem. East was the driest prior to the rain. So that area was the driest, but still impacted by the rain. And really, when you look at sugar content, it was, we had a warm, wet, cloud cover fall. So we'll show you some data on that during the presentation, but that definitely put a lid on our sugar, unfortunately. And those record weather conditions were a challenge for sugar. So you look back, 2018 was also a lower sugar year. So when you look at these climate data, you'll see the red line on the top is the average temperature. The blue bars are the rainfall, and over the period of the growing season. So if you look at early to late August in 2018, again we had heavy rains come in, and then we had you start looking at September if it's a lot over 60, and October if we're a lot over 50. That seems to really impact our sugar content. So here in 18, we had that warm fall again and the rain right before harvest. 2019, that was another high gaining year. So I'll talk a little bit about 2021 and our gain in terms of tonnage from our third pre-harvest sample. 2019 was our highest gain from our third pre-harvest sample to date. But we had good sugar that year. So we had both growth and good sugar. But if you look at 2019, again, the temperatures are just a bit cooler going into fall, and our rainfall was a little bit later and a little bit more moderate. And so again, rainfall in the fall is not the end of the world, but it's just about how much and when and the temperatures that go along with it and getting sunlight. So if you look at 2020, we had great sugar gains. So really when it comes to fall, 2020 is what we want for sugar production. Nice, cool weather. I mean, you look at in September, we were below 60. October, we were below 50. Nice and even rainfall going to fall, even tapering off and drying out. And really we need that type of year. If we print that year every year for the fall, it would be great. I mean, good harvest conditions, all those things. Love to have 2020 over again in terms of a fall harvest and sugar production. If you look at 2021, you can see again, we're back to, we had a lot of rain, a lot of rain in fall, not even just a little rain, a lot of rain. And, we had those warm conditions and we had the cloud cover, and that really put a lid on that sugar content from that aspect. So kind of looking at grower yield, our average for the company, again, 37.5 ton. Again, our highest before was like 31.6. So that's a huge increase over our previous year. Unfortunately, only 245 RWST. If you look again, September 9th, we reached 243 RWST, and on October 15th, we were 243 RWST. So we didn't gain much that whole month, or in fact, we lost a little bit. It took us that long to get back there. And like I mentioned, the record rainfall, cloudy conditions, and we had some late leaf spots. So when you look at heat and moisture, and that favors leaf spot, and we did have that challenge for growers going in late. We did have that late leaf spot situation again. So to kind of put this crop in perspective, and I think this is something I think about a lot. It's our highest yield by a long shot. So we had 37.5 as our yield. We're still getting some beets in actually from Ontario, so maybe we'll tick up even a little bit as we bring some of those in. In 2015, which was our previous highest yield, it was 31.6. So that's a huge increase. I mean, that is crazy high. So if you look at also the gain, so we do these pre-harvest samples to try to gauge where the crop's heading and try to predict, okay, what's going to happen with this crop and where. Our third pre-harvest sample in 2021, it was our highest at 29.3. But in 2015, it was not much higher than our 27.5. That was our original high. So that was only about 4 tons per acre, and we only gained 4 tons per acre in that year. So if you think about that, you say, okay, if a crop's, compare that to 2019, which was our highest gain at 9.1 tons per acre, we had only a 19.6 ton crop in that third sample. So it was a small crop, it was a dehydrated crop, we got rain on that crop, and so it was able to gain a lot. 2021, we were fairly hydrated at that third sample. The drought was kind of broke at that point. We go, how much can that crop really gain? Our average gain from our third pre-harvest sample to finish is about 5 tons per acre. And we started earlier in 2021 than we did in 2015. So, 2015 was a later start, and also, so looking at that gain, we thought, what are we gonna hit there to be able to gain? Are we really gonna be able to gain that much? And so that was a big, big surprise. So previously, usually lower through pre-harvest samples gain more. And so this was a big surprise for us. The good news though, is I think it could have been worse for sugar. So if you look at, 2018, we were the second lowest since 2018, but we were 0.4% better. So we're at 16.6 versus 16.2. So that's good. And I think that illustrates the effort that growers are putting into the crop, both managing leaf spot and as well as highlights the genetic improvement in sugar content that we're making. So we're making a lot of gains, and we'll kind of go over some of those in the future. So those are some real positives, really, when you look at situation in which we had, again, the most challenging weather conditions by a long shot in history to build sugar, and we, still didn't do too bad. So this highlights, this is the average grower sugar percent. So this red lines indicates the 16.5. So if you start looking at that, back in September, that early to mid-September, yeah, we were on a nice trend line up, and then we dipped and had trouble getting back there until really late October. And even then we didn't gain that much. I mean, towards the end of November, we were wrapping up here and we didn't see very big gains there. So it'd been nice to take out this middle part, maybe put that on the end. I was hopeful we could get a little higher sugar, but it just wasn't in the cards with this weather, unfortunately. Let's talk a little bit about less risk. So growers have been doing a good job planting, growers planting diversity, planting a number of different varieties. And we've had a lot of good varieties available. And so I think that's pretty exciting. So if you look at from 2019 to 2021, we had between 8 and 10 acres on 8 and 10 varieties on over 5,000 plus acres. So that's pretty encouraging. And then if you look at, we've had anywhere between 16 and 15 varieties on 1,000 plus acres. So again, this is going to be another good year to try some great varieties. We have 25 available with improved sugar per ton. And so, really, as people have asked me, well, what do I plant? It's difficult to just pick a couple. I'm picking, I'm probably looking at 5 to 7 varieties, and depending on your farm situation and your disease challenges, but even on your best land, you got to try some of these different varieties and see how they perform. So yeah, if you're a seed company, you just like to be able to have 1 or 2 varieties that fit the bill and you produce a lot of it, and it's great. But unfortunately, that's not quite how it works. But the good news is there's a lot of choices and opportunity, and there's going to be some varieties here that are new that I think you'd be planting for the next few years, and you'll really like them. So again, we have greater genetic diversity than ever in our variety portfolio. Need to plant this greater genetic diversity and take advantage of the RWST increases that we're seeing. So Brian's going to talk to you about variety approval and what we're seeing, what the seed committee's been working on, both ratcheting up sugar yield and ratcheting down Casper, or ratcheting up disease tolerance in the varieties. And so we're starting to really make some progress, and we're seeing the fruits of the seed committee's goals and decisions here starting to show in this year. We have more disease tolerance than ever. So, we have these CR plus varieties that you've been hearing about, and they're great. They're awesome, but we also have some great conventional varieties that have more disease tolerance than ever and great performance. So again, the leaf spot tolerance is the highest it's ever been. Just got to work on that nematode portion a little bit going forward. Okay, so just to wrap up my portion here, again, you have many opportunities. That sugar yield is critical, so decisions made here selecting varieties is critical for maintaining that sugar yield and profitability. And also remember, keep that variety portfolio diverse. And with that, I'll stop sharing and switch over to Brian, and he'll get into some more meat and potatoes on the variety approval and the varieties.
As we move along here, everybody, if anybody has any questions at any point in time, feel free to ask questions in the Q&A tab. I know Corey covered a lot of things in a short amount of time there, but if anybody has any questions, we'll pay attention to that as we move along and answer questions as we are available. As Corey mentioned, my name is Brian Grew. I'm the research manager with Michigan Sugar Company. Trying to look here a little bit at our variety approval standards, where we are and where we're headed. First chart here is RWSA. You'll see in 2008, 2009, we had lower standards. Every 5-year goal plan that we institute to the seed companies, we're consistently trying to increase that RWSA over time to maintain profitability. Moving on to RWST, you'll see the same gradual increase in trend line here. We did make a significant jump in the 2015 to 2020 timeframe. The slope, we increased that slightly, trying to get closer to that 30 and 300 goal that was put forth. You'll see a little bit of difference here looking at the Casper of maximum tolerance allowed over time. Our 2007 to 9 goal was quite low, really good varieties at that point. We relaxed that to get more Roundup Ready varieties into our portfolio. And then over time now, with the 2015 and now the 2020 variety approval standards, we've ratcheted that back down to where we are now below the level from pre-Roundup Ready. And you'll see moving forward again into 2025, we are reducing that level even more, trying to get more tolerant varieties into our portfolio. Touching a little bit on some approval requirements that went into effect last year in 2020. We have a new maximum root aphid level. Previously, root aphid was not a specific part of variety approval. It was always a consideration when choosing between varieties, but now it is actually part of variety approval. That level is 25% infested based on our disease trial nurseries that we send the varieties out to. And I'm glad to say that all 25 varieties that are available meet this requirement. That 25% infested is where we determined we could have potential field failure. So I'm glad to say that all of our varieties have adequate levels of root aphid tolerance. Another standard that went into effect last year was for special approved varieties. There's now a maximum Casper tolerance. That number is 104.96% of check, which is similar to what a fully approved variety may have had to meet in the previous 5-year plan from 2015 to 2019. So normally a specially approved variety did not have that standard, but we felt necessary to keep varieties with better Casper tolerance. 5 years now, 2025, a few years down the road here, some goals that we've given to the seed companies to strive to. Consistent general increases in both RWSA and RWST while bringing that Casper level down even more. Right now, for the 2020 5-year plan, our maximum allowed tolerance is 95.42, and we're bringing that down a full 10% to 85.71. 85.71 is consistent with what our best non-CR plus or conventionally bred Casper varieties are right now. So a very good level of tolerance. Just trying to give you a general recap of the Michigan Sugar official variety trials from 2021. This year we planted 8 official variety trials. All 8 trials were good and we harvested them for variety approval. 5 of the 8 trials we planted at a 1.9 inch spacing, and then we thinned those back to 200 beets per 100 foot equivalent. 3 of the trials were planted at a 3.75 inch spacing. And the reason this was done this year, it was mostly due to labor issues and concerns with COVID. If you'll remember back in 2020, we planted all 8 official variety trials to stand. We did not have the labor needed to do our summer thinning, and we're just trying to get back to a little bit closer to normal here, planting the trials and thinning them. And the main reason we thin these trials, over half the varieties in these trials are experimental. They do not have commercial seed preparation, and sometimes at their emergence and vigor are a little bit low. So that's why we try to give every variety an equal playing field, thin it back to the same stand. These trials consist of 8 replications of 52 varieties. 2 out of the 8, our trial with Minningers in Middleton and Trost in Pigeon had to be replanted. They were a little bit of an inadequate stand due to crusting as well as some frost issues. I'm glad to say that both of those trials turned into very good trials. Quadris applied twice, both in furrow and the 6 to 8 leaf stage. All of these trials received anywhere from 6 to 8 applications of fungicide for Casper control, depending on the harvest date. We had good control in all trials. Those 6 to 8 applications include the best fungicides that we have available to us, always tank mixed, always applied with a sticker spreader. Trial quality, 4 out of the 8 trials statistically were very good. 3 trials were good and 1 trial was fair. That 1 trial had a little bit of gappiness and stand issues, but we were still able to use that trial for approval. The harvest dates of these trials ranged from September 20th to November 5th. And 3 of the trials that were harvested in late October or early November, we put roots into our variety storage room. So we're going to process those beets sometime in February and try to determine if there's any differences in storage between the varieties. Our Casper nurseries, this year we planted 3 trials. 2 of them we were able to use for approval. These trials are also planted at a 2-inch spacing. We thin them to 200 beets equivalent. The 2 that we used, both good trials. The 3rd one, we had some emergence issues, and then we also had some wildlife damage right after the thinning took place, which reduced the stand even more. So we were not able to use that trial. These trials are never sprayed with fungicide. We inoculate them with disease sometime around the 1st to 2nd week of July near row closure. These trials have 6 replications, one of them, which is an observation rep. We are able to look at those varieties in that replication and know what they are. The remaining 5 replications are coded. We rate those 5 replications. We have the team and I have no idea the variety that we're looking at to try to not show favoritism towards any specific variety. On the left side of your screen, you'll see a picture with a leaf with a rating of 3. We've determined through many years of testing that level of 3 is when we begin to be able to recognize economic impact. So we begin rating the trials when the worst variety is at a 3, and we continue rating on a 2 to 4 day interval until the worst varieties are a rating of 9, which is similar to the picture on the right hand side of your screen. Typically we rate anywhere from 5 to 7 times. This year, a little bit slower progression of disease. During that time frame, I think we were able to rate the 1 trial 9 times. During these ratings, we continue to increase disease pressure with irrigation. These trials were really good this year. When possible, we take alternaria ratings from these trials. There was some alternaria that presented itself this year, but not enough to differentiate between varieties. And one small note, all varieties that we can currently grow and currently are testing will suffer economic loss if not protected with fungicides. We see that at the end of the year, even our best, most tolerant, even the new CR Plus varieties require fungicide for management. Moving on to the root disease nurseries. This year, there was 2 Rhizoctonia nurseries planted in Michigan. We were able to use data from one of them for variety approval. The second trial had low disease levels, and then we had issues with a late harvest. But the one trial we got gave us very good data. We send out all of our varieties to additional disease nurseries throughout the country. Things that we're not able to test here in Michigan, such as root aphid, Aphanomyces, Fusarium, Rhizomania, and we also have a nematode screening done in a greenhouse at MSU. All of these are critical parts of variety selection. You'll see them on the chart that is on my next slide here. Bringing a little bit more focus onto the one aspect of these disease nurseries, our Fusarium nursery that we are conducting with American Crystal in Minnesota, North Dakota. Our plant pathologist here in Michigan, Linda Hansen, has determined that from her most recent samplings over the last several years, we may be combating a separate strain of Fusarium than what they test for at American Crystal. So we are interested in developing a Fusarium nursery here in Michigan. If anybody listening there or anybody knows of anybody who has Fusarium issues in their fields, we'd be glad to get in contact with them to try to develop a nursery here in Michigan. This next page here, this is our summary of 2 years worth of data for all approved varieties to sell in 2022. It's a busy sheet. It'll be page 3 in the book that's going in the mail today. I have copies available if anybody'd like to contact me for one. On the left-hand side of the chart, you'll see 4 varieties that have asterisks next to them. Those are the varieties that are used to determine the percent of check values. Those 4 varieties averaged together give you 100% of check for any of the columns across the sheet. A very useful sheet. Like I say, it'll be in the book here that's going in the mail today. Moving on to some of the seed positive and negative characteristics here. We'll start with ACH seeds, a variety Crystal 675 with above average RWSA and RWST, good overall disease traits. That variety ranks #1 in our average of 2 years worth of data ranked by RWSA. Crystal 752, a little bit below average RWSA and RWST, a nematode tolerant variety. It's shown some weakness sometimes in the field on root diseases, but it has relatively good overall disease traits. Crystal 919, workhorse type variety, a little bit below average RWSA and RWST. Of all the varieties tested this year that were not CR plus, this has the best leaf spot tolerance, Crystal 919. Very well-rounded disease traits. You'll see in some of the information from Sugarbeet Advancement, this variety did perform really well in their CR plus trials, as well in some of their trials that had some adverse conditions. A very, very well-rounded variety. Crystal 932 NT, nematode tolerant variety with above average RWSA and RWST. A good root rot tolerance, but slightly weak on Cercospora. That variety ranks number 5 on our average of 2 years worth of data. You'll notice the trend here with a lot of the nematode tolerant varieties with the weakness to Cercospora. I know that's something that the companies are working on, but it's something that really needs to be considered. And Dennis will go into more detail on that. For limited approval from ACH, Crystal 021, it's above average RWSA and RWST. This is a CR plus variety. This is currently the only CR plus variety that's on track for full approval. Nursery trials show a slight susceptibility to root aphids, but as I mentioned before, all the varieties that we have available to us meet the approval standards, and we feel that we are confident that there won't be any failures. Good overall disease traits with this. That variety ranks number 4 on our average of 2 years worth of data. Special approved variety, Crystal 049, above average RWSA, a little bit below average RWST. This is another CR plus variety, excellent Cercospora tolerance, very good overall disease traits, and this variety ranked number 2 on our average of 2 years worth of data. And this was approved at 5%. Moving on to beta seed, some fully approved varieties, 1703. 1703 has above average RWSA and RWST, very good Cercospora tolerance and alternaria tolerance, and well-rounded disease package. 1703 had been one of the better varieties for Cercospora tolerance prior to the introduction of CR plus. Still very good variety, very, very well-rounded. Beta 197N, nematode tolerant variety with above average RWSA and slightly below average RWST. Good root rot tolerance, but then again, here's another nematode variety. It's slightly weak on Cercospora. 1606, nematode tolerant variety, specially approved, been around for a few years now. Above average RWSA, slightly below average RWST, good overall disease traits. Sugarbeet Advancement had that variety in their trial this year. They showed some positive yield results from that. Very good in the Sugarbeet Advancement trials. 1941, it's a CR plus variety. Out of all varieties tested in 2021, this has the best Cercospora tolerance, not by much over the other CR plus, but it did rank number 1. Above average RWSA, but slightly below average RWST. 1065, above average RWSA with below average RWST. This is another CR plus variety, slightly weak on Rhizoctonia compared to the other CR plus varieties. Hillshog, fully approved varieties. Several of these varieties were not returned for our 2021 testing, so we don't have the most up-to-date data. 9879, it's a nematode tolerant variety, a little bit below average RWSA, but good RWST. This had previously been one of our best Cercospora tolerant varieties with nematode tolerance, slightly weak on root diseases. Excuse me. 9865, this variety did remain in testing, a good variety with above average RWSA and RWST, slightly weak on fusarium, but otherwise positive disease traits. 9908, this variety did not return for 2021 variety trial testing, but still some seed supply. A little bit below average RWSA, but above average RWST, sweet variety with good leaf spot tolerance, slightly weak on Aphanomyces and fusarium. 2240 from Hillshog, below average RWSA and RWST, but very good Cercospora tolerance. That variety is also slightly weak on Rhizoctonia and fusarium. 2238 NT, this variety is a nematode tolerant variety, below average RWSA and RWST, better Cercospora tolerance coming from a nematode tolerant variety. You'll see in the chart that Dennis shows later, there's only a handful of varieties with nematode tolerance that fall into the acceptable categories based on the Cercospora trials. This variety is a little bit weak on Aphanomyces and fusarium. A new fully approved variety, 2332 NT, above average RWSA and RWST. In 2021, this variety ranked #1 for RWST of all varieties tested. Very sweet variety with nematode tolerance. Slightly weak on Cercospora and Fusarium. In terms of Cercospora, it falls right in line with a lot of the other nematode tolerant varieties in terms of tolerance levels. 2361, a limited approved variety from Hillshog. Above average RWSA and RWST. Very good Rhizoctonia tolerance and very well-rounded disease traits. This variety ranks right in line with a lot of the other high-performing, high-yielding varieties with very good disease tolerance. Marabou, fully approved varieties from them. 709, below average RWSA and RWST, but very good Cercospora and Rhizoctonia tolerance. Slightly weak on the other root diseases of Phantomyces and Fusarium. Marabou 709 does relatively well in our plant to stand trials with good emergence, maintains good levels throughout the season, and when planted in a high yielding environment has done very well for us. 813 NT, a nematode tolerant variety, a little bit below average RWSA and RWST. Of all of our nematode tolerant varieties, this has the best Cercospora tolerance from the varieties tested in 2021. Slightly weak on a Phantomyces and Fusarium. Another variety, 814, below average RWSA and RWST, but with good Cercospora and Rhizoctonia tolerance and a slight weakness to Fusarium. Next up, Seedex, fully approved varieties. 1264, that variety was not returned to testing in 2021, but we still have, they still have some seed available. 1264 had been a variety that ranked near the top of our trials many years, above average RWSA and RWST, a good Cercospora tolerance and overall well-rounded disease traits. 1278N, nematode tolerant variety, slightly below average RWSA with good RWST. This variety had shown weaknesses to Cercospora and root aphid. Otherwise, disease traits were relatively fair. 2283, above average RWSA and RWST, good Cercospora tolerance, slight weakness to Rhizoctonia, but otherwise good disease traits. Moving into some of the newer varieties from Seedex, full approval this year, 2294, above average RWSA and RWST. These 2290 series from Seedex are definitely a step in a good direction for them in terms of disease tolerance. 2294 with good overall disease traits. 2296N, this is another nematode tolerant variety with above average RWSA and RWST, slightly weak on Cercospora, but otherwise good traits. It falls right in line with a lot of the other nematode tolerant varieties in terms of Cercospora tolerance. This variety, 2296N, ranked #3 on our average of 2 years data. Very, very high yielding potential. 2295, a limited approved variety with above average RWSA and RWST, good overall disease traits. These 2290 series varieties from Seedex, all very sweet varieties, high RWST. 2297, below average RWSA, but above average RWST. Very good Rhizoctonia tolerance in the very top of our Rhizoctonia trials from 2021. Just overall well-rounded disease traits. The last variety here from Seedex, 2201, a new variety after 2 years of testing, slightly below average RWSA, but above average RWST, and good overall disease traits. Shifting a little bit here, comparing what some of our older versus our newer varieties are. The 3 bars on the left of your screen are varieties that have been in our trials for 3 or more years. The center set of bars are varieties that have been in our trials for 2 years. And the right side has varieties that are just in 1 year, but they are on track for approval. The green bars represent RWST, the gray bars represent RWSA, and the orange bar represents leaf spot. So basically trying to show some trends over time here where we're trying to maintain or increase both RWST and RWSA over the years while reducing that leaf spot tolerance. And you'll see here that just even in a short time frame of 3 years, we are moving in the right direction with all 3 characteristics, RWST, RWSA, and leaf spot. Very encouraging things. You'll see the drastic reduction in leaf spot levels from 3-year varieties to 2-year. A lot of that has to do with the introduction of the CR plus varieties and hopefully all varieties, including our conventionally bred, continue to increase tolerance levels of Cercospora. With that, if there's any questions, as I mentioned before, please ask in the Q&A tab. Otherwise, we'll move on to Dennis Bisher to talk a little bit more about Cercospora and some other things.
Good morning, everybody. Hopefully you can see my screen okay and hear me okay. So this morning I have a few different topics I wanted to talk to you about. I'm going to go through a review of 2021. So Corey started on that review earlier. I'll continue into some more detail on that. I'll also talk about genetic tolerance to leaf spot. I'll go into some variety selection topics, and then I'll finish it up with some planting population discussion. So looking at leaf spot in 2021, we did have increased leaf spot this year versus the previous 2 years. And why was that? Well, there was several reasons. One, we had warm and wet weather in September and October. Secondly, we had some untimely fungicide applications as well. So when we talk about leaf spot, we say that generally we're going to start our fungicide applications in late June with an early EBDC. And remember, going back, that May and especially June was extremely dry. And just as we were going to begin making those first leaf spot applications, we did get some rains, much needed rain, but they were at a time right when we should begin applying fungicides. So that did often cases delay that first application for a lot of growers, just because field conditions were too wet and they couldn't get the sprayers out there. So often what we had to do in many cases is growers skipped the first EBDC and went right to their first tank mix application. The second thing that happened is September applications were also delayed or missed as well in some cases. Once again, that was partly due to weather. September was wetter than normal. We had a lot of rain, made it a little tough to get out in the field and get those applications on time. And in some cases, we just became a little complacent in our disease control strategy. September was going into September, we were really clean on disease. Previous couple of years, we haven't had much leaf spot. So I think some growers got a little lax and just decided to put the sprayers away a little too early. And then finally, we did have increased acres planted to susceptible varieties this year as well. So looking at economic loss from leaf spot over the last several years. So each fall, the field consultants, before permanent pile begins, rate each field for economic impact to leaf spot. And we classify that in two categories, major loss and economic damage. Major loss means that the field is completely burned down or almost completely burned down. Economic damage is generally where you can just start to see it from the road, is what we use for rating purposes, or it would actually be that you just can't even see it from the road yet, but it's still reached economic damage. So looking at 2018, we had about 50,000 of our permanent pile acres had economic damage to leaf spot. In 2019, we dropped that to 10,000. So that was a huge reduction in 1 year. 2020, last year, was down to 4,000 acres with economic impact to leaf spot. So we had been trending in the right direction. And this year we had a significant increase in acres, going back up to 25,000 acres with economic impact to leaf spot. Now, I will say that this year's economic impact was likely less and was less than in 2018. I still did play a role. If you go back to 2018, we had fields burning down in August and early September. This year, fields that burned down didn't burn down generally till later, sometime in September. And a lot of these fields of this 25,000 acres that reached economic impact, that didn't happen till really close to permanent pile, as we dealt with conditions that were conducive to leaf spot in late September and October. So definitely a trend in the wrong direction with more acres. But in general, this year, of that 25,000 acres, fewer acres had severe economic impact compared to previous years. So looking at the weather in September, October, and looking at rain totals. So if you go back to the monthly rainfall of September of 2020, we had almost 6 inches of rain. And this year was quite a bit wetter. We had over 10 inches of rain in September. And comparing that, and then you go to October of this year, we had about 3 inches of rain in October of 2020. So remember, October 2020 was pretty dry. We had really good conditions during permanent pile. 2021, we had almost 6 inches of rain, so much wetter October. So when you add those 2 months together, 2020 and 2021, when you add September and October of 2020 and 2021 together, you can see we had about 9 inches of rain in September, October of 2020, and over 16 inches this year in those 2 months. So much higher rainfall, which did increase our disease pressure to leaf spot. And second thing is in September, October were much warmer this year too compared to last. So September of 2020, our average temperature was around 59 degrees. This year, our average temperature was 62 degrees in September. So generally, that's almost a 3-degree warmer month. And when you look at temperatures, when you start talking 1 to 2 degrees is usually a lot. September was 3 months warmer. And then look at October. October had a 47-degree average temperature in 2020 and a 56-degree average temperature in 2021. So a much warmer October. Especially in the beginning of October, the first couple of weeks of October, we had a lot of temperatures above 70 degrees, and really leaf spot continued on because of that moisture we had and the higher temperatures, where normally we would start to see leaf spot starting to scale back, not having as much pressure. This year, that wasn't the case. So sugar did play a role with leaf spot for the season, but it was pretty minimal. I think most of the impact from average grower sugar was more due to the weather, warm and wet. In the end of August, we were around 16% sugar, and that really continued pretty flat until the start of permanent pile, when we did start to see an increase, but it was a rather slow increase. So leaf spot did impact sugar this year, but it was pretty minimal. Most of the impact of poor leaf sugar content was due to weather conditions. Looking at accumulated DSVs, so we track DSVs from 2004 to the present. This year we had 223 DSVs. That's our second highest year on record, higher than 2020 and higher than 2019. And that showed in how much disease we had at the end of the growing season. So looking at genetic tolerance to leaf spot. So in this year we had about 56% of our acres planted to tolerant or highly tolerant varieties. That's up from just over 50% last year and up from the previous 2 years as well. Looking at moderately tolerant acres, we did had a pretty significant drop in moderately tolerant acres this year. We dropped from 48% in 2020 to 30% in 2021. So if you look at 2020, we had about half of our acres planted to tolerant varieties and half of our acres planted to moderately tolerant varieties. This year we had a little more tolerant varieties, but less moderately tolerant varieties, and we had an increase in susceptible varieties. So in 2020, we had less than 1% of our acres planted to a susceptible variety. This year that increased to 14%. So not a trend that we really like or prefer. We'd rather prefer to see these tolerant or highly tolerant varieties be planted on more acres, and susceptible varieties be planted on very few acres. So comparing leaf spot in 2018 to 2021, so DSVs for those 2 years were pretty similar, indicating that the environment was conducive, had similar conditions that were conducive to leaf spot in the 2 years. But we had less acres impacted by leaf spot this year versus 2018. In 2018, 50,000 acres were impacted by leaf spot. 2021, this year, 25,000 acres were impacted by leaf spot. So about half as many acres as the last year with similar DSVs. So what happened? Why did we have similar DSVs, similar conditions for leaf spot, but have less overall acres impact? I think one of the reasons is genetic tolerance to leaf spot. So if you go back to 2018, less than 20% of our acres were planted to a tolerant variety. This year in 2021, 56% of our acres were planted to a tolerant variety. Moderately tolerant stayed pretty similar between 18 and 2021 at around 30%. But the other thing is susceptible varieties decreased drastically. So in 2018, our susceptible varieties were half of our acres. This year, that was down to 14%. So there is no doubt that having more varieties planted on more acres that were tolerant to leaf spot played a huge role in us having less of an economic impact this year. In addition to the more acres being planted to tolerant varieties, the butter fungicide programs play a role too. You growers have done a great job of getting out there and starting earlier with your leaf spot spray program, beginning in late June. You guys are using shorter application intervals. We're generally on a 14-day interval or less. We have better coverage. You guys are you spent some money, bought some new nozzles. You're using the right adjuvants with the right water volume. So you've really improved your coverage in the last several years. And you're utilizing the most effective fungicides. I'd say in general, the best fungicides are being applied. Tin has been in the program. The best triazoles are being used. You guys have really done a great job of putting a lot of effort into controlling disease, and that's played a role in the less leaf spot this year as well. So I'll have more information on leaf spot this winter, but really variety selection is the first step in a leaf spot control program. The varieties that you purchase and order in the next 3 to 4 weeks really determine how your leaf spot program is going to go for the season, how many times you're going to have to spray, and what your risk is for developing leaf spot. And additionally, there are 4 highly tolerant CR plus varieties this year that I'll get some more information about those as well. So when you look at genetic tolerance to leaf spot, first, you have to remember that all varieties will suffer from economic impact to leaf spot if left untreated. We don't have any varieties that have enough genetic tolerance, including the CR plus varieties, that if you leave them unsprayed for the growing season, that they will not suffer economic impact, and generally they will burn down. Now, tolerant varieties do slow the speed and severity of infection. So when you compare a tolerant variety to a susceptible variety, a tolerant variety will generally develop initial leaf spot a little later, and then will not become as severe as fast, but eventually all varieties will burn down. And susceptible varieties are relying heavily on fungicide performance for disease control. The amount of genetic tolerance in susceptible varieties is really seems to be quite minimal, and most of that disease control, a lot of that disease control is coming from fungicide applications. So looking at the Casper nursery, this was at the Saginaw Valley Research and Extension Center. I took these pictures on August 26th of this growing season. On the left, we have a highly tolerant variety, so that would be a CR plus variety. Once again, a little background on this Casper nursery. So it is inoculated with Casper leaf spot, and it is then irrigated to help promote disease development. And it is never sprayed with any fungicide. So there's no fungicides applied throughout the growing season. The only difference you're seeing here is that genetic tolerance and how different varieties react and respond to leaf spot pressure. So the highly tolerant variety on August 26th, still pretty green, full canopy. When zooming in and looking closer, you could find spots on the leaves. So there was disease present, but still holding pretty well. Tolerant variety was basically beginning to burn down. A moderately tolerant variety had completely burned down, and a susceptible variety was completely burned down and starting to regrow. So I think this is a pretty good example of how that genetic tolerance varies. As you go to highly tolerant varieties, that disease starts out slower, takes longer to progress compared to susceptible varieties. I want to look a little bit at a grower case study, and I think this is a good example of what can happen out in the field. So this year, a grower planted a nematode variety that was susceptible to leaf spot on April 19th. So it was a field with no nematode history. He chose a variety that had nematode tolerance, had some other traits that he required, but it was susceptible to leaf spot. So it was one of the weaker leaf spot varieties. It was planted in Eastern Huron County, which I would call Eastern Huron County moderate leaf spot pressure. It's not as high as some other growing areas, but not low risk either. So I would call it moderate leaf spot. And he used the following leaf spot program. So on June 29th, he applied EBDC. So he was pretty close on his application timing. Generally, he wanted to be out there on June 25th, but once again, that late June rain kept him out for a few days and he got in a little late. Then on July 10th, he sprayed Delaro plus Proline plus EBDC. Once again, he was a little bit later than he would like there. Generally, if we spray an EBDC, we say you need to reapply in 7 to 10 days. He got out to about 14 days, almost 14 days in this case. And that was due again to the weather. Once again, got some rainy weather and it just pushed him back. And actually, he was not planning on spraying Delaro and Proline with EBDC. He was actually planning on a triazole plus EBDC. But since he knew he was late on his first application, and this application was a little behind schedule as well, he went to a 3-way tank mix trying to get his best disease control possible early in the season. After that, he followed it up with 10 Thompson EBDC at about 14 days. And for the rest of the season, he held pretty close on that 14-day or shorter schedule. Profisol EBDC was after the 10, then another application at 10 EBDC, and then Inspire EBDC. And then in mid-September, he finished off with an application of EBDC alone. So he made that mid-September application of EBDC, thought he was going to be done with leaf spot. You know, at that point in the growing season, early September, things were leaf spot pressure and levels were still pretty low. We went and scouted the field a couple of weeks later in late September, and we realized that things were getting a little more leaf spot than we would like. And he did make another application at Super 10 late in the season. He used John Deere 3D nozzles. He had the right pressure, 20 gallons of water. So he did a good job with coverage, and Master Lock was included with all applications. So really, I call this about as close to right as you can do in a growing season. Application timings were pretty good in general, about as good as you can get in the real world. The product mix was good. He chose the best products, applied things the way they should be applied. So a really good leaf spot spray program. And this was the disease present on October 27th. So for me, it's a little scary. If you look at the picture on the left, this has reached a point of economic impact on this leaf. So we're getting quite a few spots, some more spots on the center leaf. And then on the right, you can see what we start to see when we start to get some leaf spot building. Generally, we'll start to see occasionally a plant or two together that starts to almost burn down. So this field, you couldn't see the spots from the road. There was no damage from the road, but when you walked it, there was, a left leaf spot had reached economic damage. It had just reached economic damage right before the start of harvest of permanent pile. So it was pretty minimal economic damage, if any, but it's really kind of scary for me that he did just about everything right, sprayed, made 8 fungicide applications, but still ended up with more disease than we would like. So those susceptible varieties are really can be difficult to maintain adequate disease control. They have a high risk of economic impact, so keep that in mind. As you plant more tolerant varieties, you're going to have less risk of economic impact to leaf spot than you are with susceptible varieties. And really, we should be avoiding susceptible varieties whenever possible. All the nematode varieties that are approved for sale this year are, all the susceptible varieties are nematode varieties. So that should be the only case where you would need to consider planting a susceptible variety is when you have a known nematode issue. So this is the chart with all varieties and their tolerance to leaf spot. Varieties in the upper portion in the green areas, I have more tolerance to leaf spot. The yellow is moderately tolerant and the red is susceptible. So this is all varieties. And look what happens when you take out the conventional varieties and just look at the nematode varieties. There are very few nematode varieties that have good tolerance to leaf spot. We have 2 varieties in the green or tolerant, 4 varieties in moderately tolerant, and 3 varieties in susceptible. So keep in mind, if you're in a nematode area and you have a known nematode history, you need to continue planting nematode varieties, but they are going to, in general, have reduced tolerance to leaf spot and will require more fungicide applications. So what about CR plus varieties? So there are 4 CR plus varieties for 2022. They're Crystal 021, Crystal 049, Beta 1065, and Beta 1941. Now these 4 varieties do require fewer fungicide applications and are at less risk of economic impact from leaf spot. But we have to remember that some CR plus varieties are lower on RWST. So on the left are the 4 CR plus varieties and their RWST percent of check. So keep in mind that percent of check with RWST, the higher number is better and indicates higher sugar content. I've also compared that to 4 non-CR plus varieties and their RWST percent of check. And these are some of the more commonly planted non-CR plus varieties. So Crystal 021, that one holds pretty close. It's at 99.5% of check compared to the non-CR plus varieties. But the other 3 varieties are potentially a little lower on sugar content than CR plus varieties. Now, keep in mind that lower sugar content will only hold true if you control disease in the non-CR plus varieties, because we know that leaf spot can affect both yield and quality. We've talked today several times about this leaf spot rating of 3. Once you're above the leaf spot rating of 3, we reach economic impact. Brian had a picture of that in his presentation, and that field of the case study that had reached economic impact of over 3, between 3 and 4, not quite to 4. When you get to that point, you can lose a half a ton per acre of sugar and up to a half a ton per acre of yield and a quarter point of sugar. So you can see that sugar content, even though you start out with potentially a variety with a little less potential for sugar content, that can be overcome if you get significant leaf spot that's reached economic impact. I also pay attention when Daniel starts to go through his trial results. The Ontario trial did have a significant amount of leaf spot, and you can see how the varieties with better disease tolerance and leaf spot tolerance did come to the top in that trial. So what are the fungicide recommendations for CR plus varieties? There will be 3 applications. We kind of settled in on that. That's what we recommended last year. We're pretty comfortable with that, but after doing all of our beet cash trials and our CR plus program trials, it would be July 1st, August 1st, and September 1st. So the first of each month, relatively simple. You're going to rotate fungicides. So they'll still be don't spray triazoles back to back, do not spray tin back to back, no strobies back to back, and you still will continue to tank mix with EBDC. So all the other practices and things that you have implemented in the last several years for your leaf spot control program will stay the same, other than you will reduce the number of applications from basically we were spraying every 14 days generally to now we'll be spraying it the first. So looking at our CR plus beet cash trial. So every year we do beet cash trials. And this is one, we have Crystal 021 in this example. So Crystal 021 is a CR plus variety. On the left is the untreated at a disease rating of 4.9. So that's above the threshold of 3. So it did reach economic impact. And you can see by the picture, it's getting quite a bit of leaf spot. A sugar per acre was approximately 12,900 pounds. And revenue was approximately $2,275. Over on the right is a same variety, Crystal 021, but with our standard leaf spot spray program. That has a disease rating of 2.5, so disease was low enough that it was below economic impact. Sugar per acre was 14,300 pounds, and revenue was $2,528. So applying 3 fungicide applications increased the revenue by approximately $250. So $250 of increased revenue for 3 fungicide applications is a pretty good return on investment. So keep in mind, CR plus varieties have good leaf spot genetic tolerance, but they do require fungicide applications. They will not give you season-long disease control. Looking at fungicide applications by variety. So this is all varieties and the number of fungicide recommendations that would be required based on their genetic tolerance leaf spot. On the left, we have the 4 CR plus varieties. These will take around approximately 3 fungicide applications for the growing season. Then we move into the tolerant zone. These generally are going to take around 6 fungicide applications, maybe up to 7, depending on the growing season. Moderately tolerant varieties will take 7 fungicide applications and possibly up to 8, depending on the growing season. And then your susceptible varieties will take 8 fungicide applications for season-long control and possibly up to 9. So there's a pretty big range on how many times you're going to have to spray for leaf spot, depending on the varieties that you choose and their genetic tolerance to leaf spot. So once again, this is all 25 varieties this year. And really going to encourage you to try to choose as many varieties as you can from the tolerant and highly tolerant. I know there's going to be cases where we have to go into moderately tolerant and maybe even susceptible, but really we need to keep leaf spot tolerance a focus as we look at our variety selection. So to me, that's still the biggest thing. When you're choosing varieties, leaf spot tolerance needs to be one of the most important aspects that you look at. After nematode tolerance, we know that if you have nematodes, you have to plant a nematode resistant variety. Also need to continue to look at root diseases. Rhizoc and Aphanomyces continue to be an issue. We are continuing to see increased fusarium. I would call fusarium widely spread across the growing area, but the incidence rate is relatively low. So even though it's basically across all the growing area, in general, there just isn't, and most times there is not a lot of disease that seems to be giving much of a yield impact. Root aphids, we always want to watch for root aphids as well. There is no rescue treatments for once you have root aphids. It's all genetic tolerance. Brian has been talking about that, all varieties this year are under the 25% threshold that we require for seed approval. So we really feel that the root aphid requirement is that we have at seed committee is going to really reduce your risk of having much impact from root aphids. Nematodes, keep in mind that nematode varieties generally have less tolerance to leaf spot than non-nematode varieties. And RWST and RWSA need to be a focus, and with especially a focus on RWST. It's really important we have varieties with good RWST in order to maximize economic return. So that's all I have on varieties and leaf spot. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and go into the determining planting population. So when you look at planting population, one of the most common questions I get between now and planting season is, what population should I be at for my row spacing? And for me, it comes back to, I usually answer that question with a question. To me, it comes back to, what do you want for a final stand? So what are you looking for after emergence is complete for beets in 100 feet? Is it 200 beets in 100 feet? Is it 175? Is it 150? And really all of the above are correct. Any of those answers can be the right answer. It's dependent on row spacing, soil type, yield potential. We know sandier soils cannot handle and should not have the same amount of beets per 100 foot as your higher producing, higher fertility areas of the field. And the other thing that plays a big role is emergence. What is your expected emergence? We know in sugar beets, it can really vary from field to field and year to year what our emergence is. It could be 80% emergence, 70% emergence, 60% emergence, and there's times we could be 50% emergence or less. So emergence does play a pretty good big role in determining your planting population. And emergence can be very variable. A lot of it depends on the growing season and weather. There's years where we have really good emergence on all fields, and there's other years where we don't. Generally, if we have poor emergence because we received some rain after planting, then got dry and we got a crust, and beets just struggle to go through. Other times we just get a heavy rain and it creates compacted soils and the beets are unable to emerge. So weather is probably the biggest factor. It's also variety. Some varieties emerge faster than others. Some have better emergence. So it can vary a lot from variety to variety as well. And we can have it can be variable within fields as well. So if we have a sand ridge going through part of a field, we know emergence is generally going to be good on sand just because there's no crusting issues, where if you get down to some areas with heavy clay content or even a heavy clay knoll, you're likely going to have lower emergence. So that is a opportunity for variable rate seeding that some areas of the field should have a different planting population than others. So looking at emergence the last couple of years, if you go back to 2020, our Michigan Sugar's OVT emergence was 58%, and this year it was 57%. So pretty consistent over the last 2 years. Emergence in the Sugarbeet advancement trials in 2020 was 70%. This year it was 66%. So you might ask, why was emergence so much better in the Sugarbeet advancement trials versus the OVT trials? Well, one thing is to consider is often the OVT seed for 2 years before it reaches approval is not commercially prepared, so it can be of a little lower quality, and we just don't get as good of emergence because of that. And that's one of the reasons that those trials are planet thick and then thinned in order to ensure that there's a good stand across all varieties. Looking at the emergence range, so range on the right. So in 2020, if you look from varieties, we had from 49% to 65% emergence from variety to variety. And in 2020, we had 52 to 62% emergence. So it can be a pretty big difference in percent emergence based on varieties planted. One tool that I think is pretty useful is found in the agronomy button. So this spring in the Michigan Sugar app that's available on your phones, we created this agronomy button. And in there, there's some different functions. There's the diseases, weeds, pests, seed varieties, stand calculator, and seed calculator. So the seed calculator and the stand calculator can be pretty useful to help determine what planting population you should be at. So looking closer at the seed calculator, it allows to enter your row spacing. And in this example, I used 30-inch rows. Enter the desired final stand. So that's how many beets you want in 100 feet. So in this example, I used 200 beets in 100 feet. And then you enter your expected emergence. And in this example, I used 70%. So 30-inch rows, 200 beets in 100 feet is the final stand, and 70% expected emergence. you should plant 286 seeds per 100 feet. That will be a seed spacing of 4.2 inches and a population of approximately 50,000 seeds per acre. What happens if you compare that to and reduce emergence? So same example, I took the expected emergence from 70% to 60%. And in this situation, we had to increase the population from 50,000 seeds per acre to 58,000 seeds per acre in order to get that same desired final stand of 200 beets in 100 feet of row. Looking at an example of narrow rows, so 20-inch rows, a desired final stand of 180 plants in 100 feet, 70% expected emergence. We would need 257 seeds in 100 feet with a spacing of 4.67 inches and a population of 67,000. Comparing that again with reducing that expected emergence by 10%. So going from, same example, going from 70% expected emergence to 60% expected emergence, the required seeding rate would need to increase from 67,000 seeds per acre to 78,000 seeds per acre. So pretty big difference of how many of what your planting population should be depending on expected emergence. And emergence can vary quite a bit from field to field and soil type to soil type. I'd say it's hard to get much higher than 80% emergence. It can happen, but it has to be really good conditions. Generally, we're going to have less emergence than that. Another tool inside the app is the stand calculator. This kind of lets you look at it from an opposite direction. So you enter your row spacing, 30-inch rows, enter your planned planting population. In this example, I used 55,000 seeds per acre and put in an expected emergence of 65%. Touch this calculate, and it's indicates that at 30-inch rows, 55,000 seeds, 65% emergence, you will have 205 plants per 100 feet. And it also gives you your seed spacing and how many seeds would be in 100 feet. So just another way to look at it. If you know what your planting population is going to be, what your expecting emergence is, you can look and see if it's going to get you to that final stand that you like. So moving on, another tool is seed varieties in the app. So this, when you click this button, it basically gives you all varieties that are on the one-page sheet. So you have the Michigan Sugar OBT Trials one-page sheet that has all varieties listed and all their traits. In here, you can choose up to 3 traits. It has the same data that you find on that one-page sheet. So in this example, I put a check mark next to 3 different varieties. I touch the compare button, and then it does give me all their characteristics. I find this to be a very useful tool, especially when you've narrowed down your seed choice and seed selection to 1 to 2 varieties or up to 3 varieties for a field. You can then compare them side by side and figure out maybe which variety is exactly right for your situation. So that's all I had. If you have any questions, feel free to type them into the question and answer, and we can answer those either at the end or as they come up. I will say that Daniel is up next, and he will switch to his presentation.
All right, well, thank you for that introduction, Dennis. All right, well, good morning, everyone. My name is Daniel Bublitz. I'm the Director of Sugarbeet Advancement, and today I'm going to be discussing the results from the Sugarbeet Advancement Variety Trials from this past year. So this past year, Sugarbeet Advancement had 7 of the standard variety trials throughout the growing area, with 6 of them being here in Michigan and 1 being over in Ontario, Canada. And so with these trials, we compared 12 different varieties, 4 that were submitted by Beta Seed, 4 from ACH, then 2 from Seedex, and 2 from Hillshog. And so this year, in addition to having these standard variety trials, Sugarbeet Advancement also had something a little bit new, which were CR Plus specific trials, where we looked at several of the CR Plus varieties under different spray programs. So when looking back on the variety trials from this past year, overall, for the most part, we had fairly decent weather throughout the season, with a couple of exceptions. So we did have some freezing damage that occurred early. So about mid-April, we had some freezing weather that came in and caused some reduced stands. Then Later in the end of June, we had some heavy rains that came in, particularly in the west. So it's had an impact on the Schaffner and the Crabble trials. Then later in the summer, we had some stretches of dry weather that had a little bit of an impact. And the Kretschmer trial from up by Caseville was particularly dry. And so then, as Dennis and Corey both mentioned in their presentations, when we got into the fall, we had an increase in the amount of rainfall and warmer than the normal temperatures in both September and October. This led to some really phenomenal yields, but also some increase in Casper leaf spot. And so the trial quality, which is how good of statistical data the trials gave us, the range was anywhere from fair to excellent, although we did end up losing one of our trials, the Schaffner trial from over by Freeland, because of the heavy rains that they were having in the fall. So I also wanted to mention that two of our advancement trials this year had some Sugarbeet's nematode present, including the Kretschmer trial with low levels of nematodes and the Wadsworth trial with moderate levels of nematode. So now for the rest of my presentation, I'm going to start by talking about the Sugarbeet advancement trials. First, talking about the averages for the trials, and then talking about the individual trials themselves. Then after that, I'll finish the presentation by discussing the CR Plus trials. So on this chart, I'm showing the average RWSA for all 12 of the varieties over the 6 standard variety trials. And so on this chart and the rest of the charts I'm going to show today, you'll see a red line that goes across them. Any of the bars that are above that line are not statistically different from the top ranking variety. So like I said, this is the average of for RWSA across the 6 variety trials. In the top statistical grouping, we had beta 1606, followed by crystal 021, then beta 1065, and crystal 932. So when we compare the results from this year to last year, probably the biggest difference is the wide range that we had in RWSA from our top yielding variety to our bottom yielding variety. In fact, this past year, that difference was about 1,500 pounds of sugar, whereas last year, the difference is only about 600 pounds of sugar. And so in large part due to that larger difference, we had some better statistical separation this year in our data than what we saw last year. And so this year, as I mentioned previously, we had 4 varieties that were in that top statistical group, whereas last year we had 9 varieties in that top grouping. And so really that better statistical separation really helps us to see the differences in the varieties better and sort out which ones are better yielding than others. And so really, I think that tonnage played quite a big role in that larger statistical difference in the wide range that we saw in RWSA this year. And so with the tonnage this year, and this is the overall average for tonnage in the trials, we had 2 varieties that were in the top statistical grouping, including crystal 021 and beta 1606. And so another thing I want to point out here is that of those 4 top RWSA varieties, all 4 of them come within the top 5 for tonnage. And so I also wanted to mention that if you look at the difference in tonnage this year from the top yielding variety to the bottom yielding variety, that difference is about 6.7 tons, whereas last year the difference is only about 2.7 tons. So again, a much wider range this year than what we saw last year. So we had a little bit of a different story when it comes to RWST. The range for this factor was about the same as what we've seen in previous years. And as far as the top statistical grouping here, we had 2 varieties in that top group, including CDX 2296 and CDX 2294. And so if you think back to those top 4 RWSA varieties, most of them were scattered somewhere kind of in the middle of the pack when it comes to RWST, with surprisingly the sweetest one being beta 1065. So now I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about some of the factors that caused the varieties to behave the way they did this year. And the first thing I'm going to talk about is emergence. And so really the big story when it came to emergence this year was the freezing conditions that the trials went through. So we had those freezing temperatures around mid-April of this spring, and that did have an impact on the stand of several of our Sugarbeet advancement trials, including the Chafin, Wadsworth, and Sylvester trials. Thankfully, it did not impact stand enough at any of these locations to make it necessary to replant. And it really seems like the impact on the final yield at these locations was fairly minimal. So when it comes to emergence, we do 2 different stand counts throughout the spring, including an early emergence count and a final emergence count. And so these counts are both done within 100 feet of row. And really the goal of the early emergence is to give a reflection on how quickly the beets come up and how fast they are coming up out of the ground. Whereas the final count is just that, taking a look at what the final end stand is and how many beets we have going into the rest of the growing season. And so the early emergence count was taken from 9 to 20 days after planting. And we had 5 varieties in the top statistical grouping here, including Beta 1065, Beta 1606, then Crystal 752, 675, and Crystal 021. And so this is kind of a trend that we've seen for the last several years, that it seems like the Beta and Crystal varieties emerge more quickly than what the Cedex and Hillshog varieties do. When it comes to final emergence, however, we see a lot of those varieties actually kind of switch places, where we have some of the Cedex and Hillshog varieties having better final stands than what some of the Beta and Crystal varieties do. And again, that's a trend that we've seen over the past several years now. And so these final counts are taken from 35 to 56 days after planting. And the top variety here was Cedex 2294, followed by Hillshog 2238, Cedex 2296, Beta 1065, Crystal 021, Crystal 750, and Crystal 752. And so another thing I want to point out here is that if you look at our 2 poorest emerging varieties, Beta 197 and Hillshog 9865, those were also 2 of our poorest yielding varieties when it came to RWSA. And it seems very likely that their poor emergence played a big role in them not yielding so well. So another major factor when it came to how the varieties performed in the trials this year was disease pressure. And so this year we had both root and foliar diseases appear in the advancement trials. And so for root disease, it seems like we have either had a moderate level or a very low level of root disease in the trials without really all that much in between. And so we saw all 3 of the major root diseases that we have in the state appear in the trials this year, including Rhizoctonia, Aphanomyces, and Fusarium. And it seemed like all 3 of these were present at most of our trials, but the exact amount of each one varied based on the location where we were at. Then when it comes to foliar diseases this year, we saw very little alternary leaf spot in the trials this year. And for most of the season, we also saw very little Casper leaf spot, although that changed in September and October with the warm and wet conditions that we had then that really caused the amount of Casper to ramp up. And actually, we were able to rate 3 of our trials for that disease. And again, because it came on really late in the season, Casper had a greater impact on our permanent pile trials than the early dig trials. So in order to evaluate the trials for these diseases, we do a couple of different measures. The first of these is the deadbeat count. And so that's our way of evaluating the trials for root disease. And it's really just that. It's the number of dead beets in 1,200 feet of row. And generally those beets are being killed by one of those 3 major root diseases. And so this chart, as well as the leaf spot rating that I'll show you in the next slide, those 2 are a little bit different from what the other charts are that I showed today. And that a lower number is better because that means there's less disease in that variety. And so when it comes to deadbeat counts, we actually had 4 varieties in that top statistical grouping, including Beta 1606, Crystal 675, Crystal 021, and Beta 1703. And so if you remember back to those top 4 RWSA varieties that we had in the trials this year, 2 of those actually appear in the top statistical group for the deadbeat counts, and the other 2 are immediately behind that top statistical grouping. And so really that goes to show how important it is to have a good root disease package when you're selecting the varieties for your farm. So on this slide, I have the leaf spot ratings that we took from some of our trials this year. These were taken from 3 different trials, including the Chafin, Schaffner, and Wadsworth trial. The ratings were taken immediately before harvest, and they're rating from anywhere from 0 to 9, with 0 being no leaf spots observed and 9 being complete burn down. And again, as Dennis mentioned in his presentation, generally we expect there to be economic loss at a 3 or above. And so here we actually had 2 varieties in the top statistical grouping, including Crystal 021 and Beta 1065. And really, it's not all that surprising that those 2 came to the top when it comes to leaf spot rating, because those are the 2 CR plus varieties that we had in the standard trials this year. And so because we really expected those to do quite a bit better than the other varieties for leaf spot, I really didn't feel like this told the full story by just showing that top statistical group. And so what I did on this slide was I also broke up the varieties based on their approximate statistical grouping. And so just kind of because of how the stats turn out, there's a little bit of overlap between the groups, but overall it gives a pretty good idea of how the varieties stacked up in the trials. And so as I said, in the top statistical group, we have the 2 CR plus varieties. You can think of those as the highly tolerant varieties. Then that next statistical group is more of the traditionally tolerant non-CR plus varieties. And so those include Beta 1703, Crystal 675, and CDX 2294. Then the next statistical group is what we think of as the moderately tolerant varieties. And then at the very end with the more susceptible varieties. And so one other thing I wanted to point out here is that we do see a lot of our nematode varieties coming at the back of the pack as far as how they do against Casper leaf spot. And so hopefully that's something that the breeders can work on going forward. All right, so now I'm going to change gears and talk about the individual variety trials that we had this year. And so for each one, I'm going to give a brief description about how the trials went and some of the key factors to look for within each trial. And then I'll give the chart showing the average RWSA for each one of the varieties at that location. So the first trial that I'm going to discuss is the Chafin trial from over by Ithaca. This one was actually the first Sugarbeet advancement trial planted this year, and it went in on March 23rd. It was harvested on October 20th, and the overall trial quality here was excellent. And so a couple of the key characteristics to point out at this location was that there was manure applied the fall before the beet crop was planted, and so it definitely had a positive impact on tonnage here. Then also, because this trial was planted so early in the season, it did experience the freezing temperatures that we had in mid-April, and those temperatures definitely did impact the stands that we saw here. Then as far as disease goes, we had a low level of root disease here, but we had a moderate level of Casper leaf spot. And so this location was evaluated for that disease. So when it comes to the average RWSA, here we actually had just one variety come up into that top statistical grouping, and that was Beta 1065. And we think that a large part of the reason why it did so well here was because of its tolerance to Casper. So the next location I'm going to discuss is the Sylvester trial from over by Fairgrove. This one was planted on April 5th and harvested on September 17th. And the overall trial quality here was excellent. And so a couple of key points to mention here was that, again, because it was planted fairly early, it did experience the freezing temperatures, but it really didn't have that much of an impact on stand or yield at this location. And so when it comes to root disease, we had an extremely low level of root disease at this trial. And for Casper leaf spot, we had a low level all season long, but we could find it here for most of the season. But as I mentioned, the level stayed very low throughout the season and well below the economic threshold. And so by the time that we harvested this trial, we were still not able to rate the varieties for that disease. And so really, because of the low levels of disease and really the lack of outside forces acting upon the varieties here, I feel like this is really a good location to evaluate the trials based on their pure yield potential. And so at this location, we had 2 varieties come into our top statistical group, including Beta 1065 and Crystal 021, which actually Tom and I were fairly surprised to see these 2 CR plus varieties do so well at this location, because we really didn't have all that much Casper pressure. So we would expect them maybe not to be so far ahead of some of the other varieties here. So the next trial that I'm going to discuss is the Kretschmer trial from up by Caseville. This one was planted on April 8th and harvested on October 23rd. The overall quality here was excellent. And so a couple of the key factors to point out here was that this trial, it was, as I said, really excellent quality, and it really looked very good all summer long. And this was one of our drier locations. It seemed to miss quite a few of the rains that other locations got. But in spite of that, we had very good yields here. This is actually our best trial when it came to sugar. So we did have a moderate level of root disease at this particular location. But interestingly, when I looked at my deadbeat count data, there was no statistical difference between any of the varieties when it came to that. But it seems like root disease tolerance did have an influence when it came to final yield. And so we also had very low levels of Casper at this location, in spite of it being a regular delivery trial. And so when it came to the end of the season, we were not able to rate this location for the disease. And so this location also did have Sugarbeet nematodes, but those levels were very low. All right, so here we actually had 7 varieties that were in the top statistical group, including beta 1606, CDX 2296, beta 1703, crystal 675, crystal 021, CDX 2294, and beta 1065. And again, I think that the tolerance to nematode could have played a slight role here, as well as root disease tolerance. So another trial that was impacted by root disease this year was the DVL trial from over by Ruth. This one was planted on April 10th and harvested on September 29th. And the quality of this trial was good. And so a couple of the key factors to point out here was that as compared to some of the trials that we've had with DVL farms in the past, this was a little bit heavier field that we were in. It was a loamy soil type, as opposed to the sandy fields that we normally have with DVL farms. Then, as I mentioned previously, we did have a moderate level of root disease here, with both Rhizoctonia and Aphanomyces being present. And so it seemed like when we were doing the deadbeat or the sugar samples this fall, we actually go out there and hand dig sugar or beets for those sugar samples. It seems like nearly every sugar beet that we dug up had Aphanomyces scarring on it. You can see a picture of that Aphanomyces scarring here on the screen. And so we do think that the Aphanomyces had an impact on the trials here at this on the varieties here at this location. And so this location also had a low level of leaf spot. And so here at this trial, we actually had 9 different varieties that were within the top statistical grouping, with the only 3 that didn't make it into that grouping being beta 197 and the 2 Hillshog varieties. So again, we think that root disease had a major impact on how the varieties shook out here. So now we're going to move over to Canada really quick and look at the Kearns trial from Ontario. This one was planted on April 14th and harvested on October 20th. The overall trial quality here was very good. And so unfortunately, because of continuing COVID-19 restrictions, we were unable to travel to Canada this year. Thankfully, the trial was still able to be conducted because Wayne Martin from Michigan Sugar volunteered to manage it for us this year. And so on behalf of the Sugarbeet advancement team and the Ontario growers, I would like to extend a warm thank you to Wayne for doing that. And so as Dennis mentioned in his presentation, the key factor and the biggest factor that influenced the varieties here at this location was the high level of Casper leaf spot that we had here at this site. And so because of the high level of leaf spot that we had, as I said, that had a major influence on the varieties here. And we saw the CR plus varieties really rise to the top. And so in the top statistical grouping, we had 3 varieties, including crystal 021, beta 1065, and again, those being CR plus varieties. Casper had a major influence on them performing so well. But then the other variety that we had in that top statistical group was beta 1606. And really, we were quite surprised to see that variety do so well in Canada. Again, because it's not really all that good against Casper, and there's no nematode pressure here. And so in fact, I would actually caution the Ontario growers from planting this variety, again, because it doesn't really do all that well against Casper, and because it's a fairly low sugar variety, and it's very high tunning. So that's going to really increase your freight cost by planting that. So the final standard variety trial that I'm going to discuss today is the Wadsworth trial from over by Sandusky. This one was planted on March 25th and harvested on November 10th. And the overall quality here was good. So a couple of the key things to point out here was that, again, since this was the second trial that got planted this year, it did experience the freezing temperatures that these early trials went through, and it did seem to reduce stands by quite a bit here. But really the major factor to look at is the amount of disease pressure that we had at this location. So there were actually 3 different diseases at play here, including a moderate level of Sugarbeet nematode, then a high level of Rhizoctonia root rot, and also a moderate level of Casper leaf spot. And so all 3 of these factors really came together to influence how the varieties performed at this location. But really the biggest factor was the moderate level of Sugarbeet nematode. And so also I wanted to mention that this trial was the second one planted by Sugarbeet Advancement this year, and the last one that we harvested. All right, and so at this location, we had 3 varieties that were in the top statistical group for RWSA, and all 3 of them were nematode varieties. And so they included Beta 1606, Crystal 752, and Crystal 932. Then in large part, the rest of the varieties shook out based on their tolerance to Casper and their tolerance to Rhizoctonia. So when reflecting upon the Sugarbeet Advancement trials this year, overall, the quality of the trials that we had this year was very good, and they really provided some very good data for us to review. Then overall, the tonnage was quite a bit higher this year than what we've seen in previous years. And we saw a greater difference in RWSA between the varieties this year than what we've seen in the past. And again, having that good statistical separation is really beneficial in being able to sort through which varieties perform better at the different locations than others. So then a couple of factors that led to how the varieties performed within the trials. Once again, the freezing temperatures that we had in early spring that impacted the stands in some locations. Then some of the locations also had a moderate level of root disease that impacted how the varieties performed. Then we also had Casper leaf spot increase late in the season, which influenced some of our regular dig trials. And so when reviewing the Sugarbeet Advancement data and using it to help guide your selection for varieties this year, it's really important to remember that each of these trials was influenced by a different set of factors. And so when evaluating the trials and using that data, it's really important, I feel like, to look for the locations that went through similar factors to what your farm has. Because really choosing varieties that are good against the specific factors on your farm is really an important key to successfully selecting varieties and to having success with your crop the following year. And so this is the last chart that I have for the standard variety trials. And on this chart, I am showing how many times each variety appeared in the top statistical grouping out of the 6 trials that we had. And so this is ranked by RWSA. And I feel like this slide is really a fairly important one to pay attention to, because it's really a good reflection on how robust each variety is. Because if it can appear in the top statistical grouping multiple times at different locations, that really reflects that it's a resilient variety that can do well under a number of different factors. And so here for our top 4 RWSA varieties, the top 2, Beta 1606 and Crystal 021, those appeared in the top statistical grouping 4 times. And the next one, Beta 1065, was in that top grouping 5 times. And the last one of the 4, Crystal 932, was in that top grouping twice. So we actually had several varieties that did appear in that top grouping twice, and then a few varieties that never appeared in the top statistical grouping in any of our trials. All right, so now I'm going to shift gears here one more time and finish my presentation by talking about the CR Plus variety trials. And so we had 2 locations of the CR Plus variety trials this year, including the Guza and the Trial trials. And so at each one of these, we had 5 different varieties that we tested and 2 different spray programs that we compared. And so for the varieties that we tested, we had 3 CR Plus varieties, including Crystal 021, Beta 1065, and Beta 1941. Then we also had 2 non-CR Plus varieties, including Crystal 919, which is the most Casper tolerant variety that we have that's non-CR Plus, and then Crystal 675, which I would describe as a moderately tolerant variety, but it's very popular among growers. And so we thought that would be a really good moderately tolerant check to include here. And so then we also had 2 spray programs that the varieties were put through, including a 3 spray program and a 6 spray program. And so Crystal 021, Beta 1065, and Crystal 919, all 3 of those went through both the spray programs, but Beta 1941 only was in the 3 spray program, and Crystal 675 was only in the 6 spray program. So now I'm going to start by talking about the Guza trial from up by Bad Axe. This one was planted on April 7th and harvested on October 27th. And the overall trial quality here was excellent. And a few of the key things to point out here was that this trial also did experience the freezing temperatures in mid-April. And we did actually see a fair amount of stand loss here because of that. And the stands throughout the trial were variable. And we also saw a moderate level of root disease at this location, but it appeared in pretty much all the different treatments that we had. And so the impact was not variety or spray program specific. Then also when it comes to Casper leaf spot, surprisingly, the disease was actually absent for most of the season or nearly absent. But again, as with many of our other trials, we saw those levels increase when we went in the fall into September and October. And by the end of the season, we did have enough to rate and that we think it could have had an impact on final yields. So for both the CR Plus trials, I'm going to give you 2 charts to show how the varieties perform. And the first chart I'm going to show is a net revenue, which I selected to show net revenue as opposed to RWSA, because since we have 2 different spray programs at 2 different costs and 2 different types of seed at 2 different costs, I really felt like it's important to factor that in, and that the RWSA wouldn't really give a fair representation of how the different treatments perform. And then the second chart that I'm going to show is the leaf spot rating for each of the locations. And so at the Guza trial, when it comes to net revenue, all 4 of the 3 spray programs, which are designated by the striped bars, were in the top statistical grouping. So they were statistically better than all 4 of the 6 spray programs. And so I think that really shows that there's an economic benefit to moving down to a 3 spray program, but still having the CR Plus to help with that Casper management. And so when it comes to the leaf spot rating, we actually saw a little bit of a different trend where the 6 spray programs had better Casper management than what the 3 spray programs did. And so in our top statistical grouping here, we had Beta 1065, the 6 spray, followed by 6 spray 021 and 6 spray 919. Then the next statistical grouping, we had the 6 spray 675, followed by the 3 spray 3 CR Plus varieties. Then our last statistical grouping was the 3 spray 919. So that one had considerably more leaf spot than all the rest of the treatments at this location. And again, the 3 is the economic threshold. So really looking here, our 6 spray programs in general did have better Casper management than what the 3 spray programs did. But again, we're so far below the economic threshold with the CR Plus that really going up to 6 sprays, it doesn't really provide that much of a benefit here. All right, so the final trial that I'm going to talk about is the Hravel trial from over by Breckenridge. This one was planted on April 17th and harvested on November 4th. The overall quality here was just fair, in large part due to the heavy rain event that came in late June. This rain event caused an increase in the root disease levels that we had, as well as water damage to the beets themselves. And so we saw all 3 of the major root diseases here, including Rhizoctonia, Aphanomyces, and Fusarium. So immediately after the rain event, we actually saw quite a few Fusarium symptoms come up, including the discoloration of the vascular tissue and the blockage of that tissue, as you can see in the top picture. Then also the half-leaf yellowing that you can see in the bottom picture. And so it does appear as if Fusarium did have a major influence here on this trial. So then late in the season, when we were digging the sugar samples, we did see a lot of Aphanomyces scarring on those roots. And so we do believe that Aphanomyces also had a fairly big role in how the varieties performed here. So then when it comes to Casper leaf spot, again, a very similar story to what we see in the other Sugarbeet advancement trials, that we had very low levels for most of the season, but then we saw levels increase quite a bit then at the end of September and into October. So on the screen now, I have a picture that was taken about a week after that major rainy week came in June. And you can see on the right, and this is showing two different varieties. On the right is Crystal 919, on the left is Crystal 021. And so for most of the season, it appeared as though Crystal 919 really took the water damage quite a bit better and appeared to be less impacted by the root diseases that were present. Unfortunately, though, taking the water damage better here did not translate into any sort of yield benefit, as there was no statistical difference in net revenue or RWSA amongst any of the treatments here. When it comes to the leaf spot rating, though, we did have a significant difference between the different treatments. And so the top statistical grouping was the 6 spray 021 and 1065. The second statistical grouping included 3 spray 1941 and 3 spray 021, as well as the 6 spray 919. Then the third statistical grouping had 3 spray beta 1065 and 6 spray crystal 675. Then the final statistical grouping with the most leaf spot was the 3 spray crystal 919. So again, it seems like having the 6 sprays did help, and having the CR plus helped to manage the Casper at this location. So in summary, it does appear as though there is an economic benefit to going to the 3 spray CR plus program. When it comes to Casper leaf spot, though, the best management was acquired with having the 6 spray program and the CR plus. Although because the economic impact of going down to 3 sprays to the CR plus, I think that makes it worth it to reduce the number of sprays. So then one last thing I did want to reiterate here is that at the probable trial, we did see the Crystal 919 take the water damage quite a bit better than the other varieties at that location. But this unfortunately did not translate into a yield benefit with this variety. And so with that, I would like to end my presentation today by thanking all of our grower cooperators who volunteered to have advancement trials on their farm. Without their work and effort that they put into these trials, there's no way that we could do the work that we do and provide this research data. So on behalf of the Sugarbeet advancement team and all the growers of the Michigan Sugar Co-op, I would like to thank those cooperators. And so with that, I'll thank you for your time, and I'll take any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Okay, we are going to include some of the seed companies as panelists, and they can help answer some questions. If you guys have questions, just submit them to the chat box.
While Elizabeth is going through that, I will, one of the questions we had yesterday is about alternaria leaf spot. In general, I would say we're seeing less alternaria leaf spot than we have in the past. You know, at one time we thought we were around 50% alternaria, 50% Cercospora. That seems to have dropped. We seem to, at least this past year, we were more dominated by Cercospora. I'm assuming that trend is going to continue, but I can't say that for sure. I think with the switch of varieties, it's probably lended a little more towards having more Cercospora than alternaria, but we'll see going forwards.
A couple of you guys that look like it worked to promote to panelists, Andy and Rob Gerstenberger. I don't know if I've got to, if you have to approve it. Oh, looks like Rob did. Okay. And then Andy, there we go. Okay, so if anybody's got any questions, looks like we've got everybody on here. We'll open it up to anybody else.
You're muted, Elizabeth.
Guys that were just added, do you guys have anything to quickly add? It doesn't look like we have any questions so far.
Can you hear me, Elizabeth? Rob Gerstenberger. Hey, yeah, I thought you guys did a good job with your presentation, so I just wanted to add that. And,
Thank you, Rob.
yeah.
Okay, with that, I think that we will end. And thank you everybody for attending. Like I said, this will be available sometime in the next few days with on our YouTube channel. And then immediately following this video, the video presentations for the seed companies will be available on our Michigan Sugar YouTube channel. Check out Ag Updates for a link to that. All right, thank you guys.
All right, bye, everybody.
Thank you. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.